Sego, everybody. So, week 8, the last week before the break, and more than halfway through the semester, folks. We're there, we're getting there. Um, Not that I'm looking forward to this ending. I'm really enjoying this group and our conversations, but I know we're all tired, and the winter semester is particularly rough on people, and we're in a pandemic, so there you go. So, week 8, our topic is two-eyed seeing, and we're also going to touch on Haudenosaunee values again. So we're kind of like winding our way through our new stuff, but again, always with reference to some older stuff. So several weeks ago, when watched some videos by Haudenosaunee people, specifically Onondaga, and we also talked about things from the beginning, like the words before all else and things like that, and creation and the peacemaker's journey. And you read some stuff about Haudenosaunee culture. Well, some of this is going to come back as well this week. So we'll get right into it. So the concept of two-eyed seeing, and at first it might seem like, wait, what does this have to do with like what we talked about last week? And it actually is connected, and as we'll see. So, or it can be. I mean, it's a very broad term that can be applied to many situations. So the first word you see here is in the Mi'kmaq language. I have a hard time pronouncing it. I'm not going to try right now. Edwap Monk. You'll hear it said by actual speakers. So, can be roughly translated as two-eyed seeing. And so, Mi'kmaq, I mean, this is the First Nation that are situated like kind of parts of what we now know as Gaspésie, Eastern Quebec, part of the Maritimes, down into Maine as well. So you might have heard the word Micmac before. Sometimes you see it spelled M-I-C-M-A-C. And, there are some folks from that nation who use that. Again, as Chelsea Vowell has pointed out, there's always individual variation, and some people will use terms that are older and that weren't necessarily accurate, but they grew up with it. But the more commonly way that we see it spelt today is like so, although sometimes you might also see it with a W at the end instead of a Q. This is a fairly large nation, so there can be regional variations within the nation as well. But the most common pronunciation that I've heard is Mi'kmaq. All right. So again, there might be regional variation there too. So Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall is renowned as the person who coined this term, two-eyed seeing. And in a nutshell, it's more complex than this, but you'll learn more about that from other people this week. And it's kind of seeing things from multiple perspectives. And in his case, for example, Mi'kmaq and Western views can come together within one person to benefit all. And as you'll see from some of the things you'll watch and read this week, a lot of this comes from this idea that, as we've learned in the beginning of colonization, indigenous folks that encountered European explorers, colonizers, traders, whoever, were for the most part, not every individual or group necessarily, but for the most part willing to kind of engage in some kind of relationship, trade, and we saw about some of those peace and friendship treaties, and to learn from each other, because indigenous peoples here for millennia have been encountering each other and learning from each other and sharing knowledge. So this was kind of a natural extension of that. And in an ideal world where the colonizers wouldn't have taken over but just kind of obeyed things, respected things like the Turo Wampum and other agreements where we could cohabitate side by side and not interfere with each other, there would have been more of this probably, instead of one worldview kind of trying to push the other out of the way, which has happened with assimilation attempts. So a lot of folks who, we've met Amanda, who's very much into resistance, and there are different strategies for dealing with things today. And somebody like Albert Marshall is of a mind of, we can take the best of both worlds in a way. We can, he's of the generation of, lots of people of that generation were taken to residential schools, didn't grow up in their own cultures, and were kind of forced to learn. the European-based way of thinking with Christianity and all the stuff that comes with that. And some folks have rejected it outright for legitimate reasons, and others have said, well, you know, the knowledge in and of itself is not bad. It's the fact that it was imposed on us that was bad. But we can still use that knowledge along with our own and try to help other people understand that our knowledge is just as valuable. So, you know, folks, when we compare and contrast Western knowledge and indigenous knowledges, it's not necessarily to put Western knowledge down. We tend to be critical of it because it's kind of taken over. But there is a lot of value in any kind of knowledge, and if we take them as complementary and try to bring them together, then it helps everybody. And that's where Albert Marshall is coming from when he talks. If you watch video interviews with him, you'll see he really kind of always brings it back to this is going to help everybody, right? And instead of saying, well, one kind of knowledge is better than the other, if we kind of blend them, you know, I kind of was reading a report, like an interview with him, and he was explaining how you can adapt this on a case-by-case basis depending on the situation. And I think we can all learn from that perspective, because in a good team, everybody brings their own skills, right? And in some certain situations, the skills of some people are going to be useful, and then they're going to be the ones to direct. And then in another situation, somebody else will direct. And the best teams that I've worked on projects, I used to be a performer and put together shows, and it was always a thing where, okay, so-and-so is better at some of these aesthetics and building props, and, you know, we're going to let that person direct that part of it. I'm good with paperwork and organizing set lists and all that kind of thing and keeping track of emails, so let me be in charge of that. And, you know, and we can learn from each other, but we still kind of listen to the people who are good at a certain thing. So there's a bit of that in there too. And then, so with respect to who's knowledgeable about a certain kind of perspective or worldview, well, maybe you'll listen to them in a situation where that's needed. So there's a lot of, again, this idea of coming together, bringing different kinds of knowledge together. So those of you, for example, maybe some of you would like to do your final project. I know I keep talking about that, but just to start getting you thinking, because really it's going to be up to you what you want to explore for that. And I'll after the break, we'll come back rested, and I'll tell you more about what that's going to look like. But you can already start thinking, oh, I'm into this, I'm into that. And so if in case any of you are really, you know, after this week, you're like, oh yeah, really, this would be useful for me in my, you know, studies or even just my personal development, whatever, you can watch these. These are not for this week. The first one here is almost 2 hours, and the second one's about 35-40 minutes, but it's just in case any of you want to explore this further for this course or another course. Okay, if you want to know more about what Albert Marshall has to say about this concept. For our purposes, and these links are also in they're embedded in the PowerPoint. So if you're looking at the PowerPoint without the video, you can click on either of them directly from the PowerPoint, but these links are also in the document that describes this week's reading activities, so reading/watching, and you have the choice between these two, and depending on your interests. So here, those of you who are fans of Rebecca Thomas, because maybe you went to her presentation earlier this semester, this 14-minute video, she does a bit of, you know, slam poetry, but also explains how her perception of the concept of two-eyed seeing. And she touches a lot on the themes of language, so, you know, the difficulty in translating concepts between languages, that kind of thing. Different things about, you know, Mi'kmaq culture and how colonization interfered with that, but also education. She works in education, so she brings up education. So that's her way of approaching the concept of two-eyed seeing. And Evan Adams is actually, I don't know if any of you are movie buffs, and if you've seen old movies, it doesn't feel old to me, but to you it'll be old. So 1998, there was it's one of the first Indigenous produced feature films that was very popular, and it's a good film. It still makes sense today, even if it's kind of it might seem like old news to you, you know. So it's called Smoke Signal. So in case any of you are interested If you're movie buffs, then you want to look into that. And so he was in Smoke Signals. He was an actor, and then he became a doctor. And he talks about two-eyed seeing. He touches on health and healing because he's a doctor, and he mentions two-eyed seeing. It might be a bit more vague. He explains it a little bit more vaguely than Rebecca Thomas, but it's still interesting if you're interested in health and healing, if you're, going into nursing or any kind of medical field, or even psychology, anything in the healing arts or sciences. You might be interested in his talk, because he comes to talk about two-eyed seeing, but he focuses on the perspective of duality, and how he uses the word dichotomy a lot. And a dichotomy is two things that kind of might appear to be opposed, or in binary opposition, but he talks about kind of usually there's a usefulness for both of these things, so they don't have to be opposed to each other. And he applies that to kind of landscapes and just life in general. He throws in a bit of his own life experience in there, but then he talks a bit about, healing and his work as a doctor, and how his, background in obviously he's a doctor. He's earned his degrees, his medical degrees, so that's from a Western perspective, but how he's kind of gotten some insight from, other indigenous people. So, depending on your interests, you can choose one of these two to get a bit more perspective on this concept of two-eyed seeing, and that's the assignment, and you're asked a question about that as well. So, then the other thing I wanted to talk to you about in these slides, and again, this is all in the document for the assignment as well, is our guest speaker. I don't know why I wrote guest speaker. This is copy-paste thing. I'll fix it before you get this. I do that a lot, eh? But there you go. I'm human with my little foibles and flaws too. So, March 10th, it's a Wednesday, and it's the last Wednesday before the break, and it's during our class time. So that week, instead of doing the Zoom on the Wednesday, we'll probably do it on the Monday. So just to give people the chance to come, if they wanted to come and talk about that week's material or the previous weeks or whatever. And then our Wednesday class is going to be devoted to this. She's not just coming for our class, it's also part of International Women's Week, which happens every year. So it's open to the public. So we're not going to use Zoom via Leia. You're going to be sent a link, kind of like with Amanda's talk. So I would hope that a lot of you would come, because it's really interesting. So Kaylee, I actually know her personally as well. Well, Amanda, our previous speaker, I hadn't met her. I'd spoken to her on Zoom, but I've known of her for almost a decade, because she does so much here in the city. But Kaylee was a student here at Vanier. She graduated last year from Environmental and Wildlife Management. And she's actually one of the first two graduates of the Indigenous Studies certificate program that I helped create. That's about 3 years old now. Some of you are in that program. So two students graduated last year. They were the first, and Kaylee was one of them. So it was really awesome. And she's an awesome person. She's very devoted to anything that she takes on. She's now at Bishop's University out in Lennoxville, studying biology. And she's Ganyenkihaga from Ganazadage, and Ganyenkihaga is one of the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as you might remember. So, and we'll learn more about Ganazadage and Ganawake and kind of local stuff after the break. So she's going to come and talk about two-eyed seeing in science. She's a strong advocate of this concept, and she uses it in her own work. So you'll get to learn about her perspective on it. And she also touches on some Haudenosaunee values. And some of it will seem familiar, but from her lived experience and tying it in actually to this idea of two-eyed seeing. And so it's really interesting, because we heard about it, we saw some videos about some of these values, and we talked about them, but some of you read about different things on that Haudenosaunee Confederacy website, but to hear, again, it's like with Amanda talking about Indigenous resistance. It's like when it's coming from a place of lived experience, there's something to it that you can never get just from reading about it or watching a short clip or something. So you can get to know Kaylee a little bit and what she's written about. There are 3 articles, and again, these are linked to in this week's document for the reading reading questions as well. You can choose one of the three. You can, if you have the time, go ahead and read all three. They're not that long, but you can choose one, again, depending on your interests. The first one is on the Vanier website, and it's something she wrote for something that they did in her program. And it's interesting because remember when we learned about the creation story with Sky Woman, the Haudenosaunee creation story, and I said that there's a part of it that we didn't really see, but they hinted at it, and it was the origin of the three sisters, which is bean, corns, and squash. And Haudenosaunee peoples grew those together, and she explains this. Some of it, there's a whole paragraph there that honestly is a bit over my head as somebody who is not in these sciences, and I did a deck in pure and applied sciences, but this is like 28 years ago. So a lot of it was over my head, but that paragraph doesn't really matter. It matters to the people who are in science, but you can still understand the message without understanding that paragraph. So if you're interested in that, kind of the three sisters and how they go together, and here these two articles are from her blog, and you can just kind of click on each one and see the beginning, and it's the one Sky Woman Falling, she talks a little bit about the Sky Woman story, but it's not all about that. It's about her experience at a conference, and the third one's a bit more personal about how she grew up appreciating nature and kind of in a very visceral, personal way. So either way, these are things where you can kind of get to know a bit about where she's coming from before going to the talk, and there's a little question about that in the reading assignment for this week as well. And so then, of course, there's a question related to the talk itself. So, and I'm going to give you, the talk's on the Wednesday. So obviously I'm not expecting you to finish the reading questions this week on the Wednesday night when the third question is only answerable after our Wednesday class. And so I'll give you till the Friday to do the assignment. It's the week before the break anyway, so there's a bit of wiggle room there. So as usual, I'm ending with some anthropological concepts that are relevant to our stuff this week. Worldview, I know it's been there on 3 or 4 slides before, but this time I'm including a bit more detail, and to help us think a little bit about this week's and week 7 also, when we're reading from Robin Wall Kimmerer, because a lot of this comes back and touches on, again, a theme that's been a common thread throughout the first half of the semester so far, is that relationship between living beings, not just humans but other living beings. So I wanted to kind of add some points on worldview so that we can start to deepen our understanding of worldview in terms of, it's the way people understand or interpret reality, but it includes not just these things, so many other things. When I teach anthropology of the supernatural, we spend the semester talking about worldview and different aspects of it. But like last week, Robin Wall Kimmerer was saying, we act on, we behave based on how we think, right? So then we come to things like, well, how do we relate to other humans, right? So all the different hierarchies we have in society based on gender, race, socioeconomic class, ability, all these things, that's all a part of our worldview. We're raised to see, depending on the society that we live in, if we're in a hierarchical society, we're raised to think that some people are naturally more entitled to more riches, more power, more privilege, more, prestige, whatever, than others. Whereas if you're raised in an egalitarian society, you're raised to see that the relationship between humans is more one of, say, interdependence, like Robin Wall Kimmerer was talking about. How do we relate to other living things? Same idea. If you're raised in a worldview that puts a hierarchy between humans and all other living beings, humans and then other animals and then plants and then whatever, then you're living life one way. Whereas if you're raised in a worldview that sees all of these things as important and valuable, and if you're living by that worldview, that looks much different. How do we relate to the planet we live on? Again, is the planet something that is just something that we can use and cut up like on a map into borders and then just dig and take what we need and whatever? Or is it something that we're in a relationship with, right? So again, just a deeper understanding of worldview and how it applies to things we've been talking about. Here's a new one for this semester, cultural adaptation. In anthropology, it sounds kind of almost degrading to talk in this way, but it doesn't have to be, because really humans everywhere, for as long as there have been humans, uh, have people have adapted to the places where they were, and biologically speaking, all living things adapt, right? You might remember learning about natural selection and evolution, but when it comes to cultural adaptation, everything that we do as humans is tied into that. So when we've been talking about the link with people, between people and the environment, it's also this thing of like generations and generations, like hundreds and thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. And when we talk about stories, not just being stories but transmitting information, it's transmitting an information about how to survive in a specific environment, which is why when through environmental violence and different forms of colonialism that environment gets messed up, that also messes up people's cultural systems, including how they relate to each other and how they relate to the world around them. So cultural adaptation is not just knowing which plants are good to eat and where the animals migrate. It also involves knowing who's around you and who, in the widest sense, everything that's alive, how to relate to all these beings, including fellow humans. So all the ways in which societies organize themselves. We can think about, for example, Haudenosaunee clan systems and their ideas of the Confederacy, and all these sorts of things are all involved in that. And that includes also ceremony for a lot of people. If you watch Rebecca Thomas's video, she brings that up, because ceremony is a part of how people relate to the world where they live. And so then we also come to symbolism, because in ceremony and in any other human activity, including communication, we're thinking and communicating in symbols. Language is full of symbols. Words are symbols, because a symbol is something that stands for something else. And they're incredibly powerful, because an action can be a symbol. So when we think about things like the churro wampum, right, there was symbolism there in that belt, in that wampum belt. There's symbolism in anything that people do. If people put tobacco down to show gratitude for a plant that they're picking, things that they do for animals that they hunt. When we read about, we'll read an article by an Inuit scholar actually after the break at some point about that, this relationship with animals, right? You'll have read about Robin Wall Kimmerer's explanation of, like, say, gathering berries, but then we'll see something similar applied way up north with, seals that people would hunt. So anyway, and lots of symbolism there, and it's all tied into how people manage to survive in particular places and attach a lot of meaning to those places. It's not just about surviving, right? It's about thriving. So definitely Indigenous people are still surviving, and in some cases thriving, but in many cases, because of colonialism, their ability to thrive has been compromised because of colonial violence and environmental violence. But people are resisting in different ways, either by reclaiming their sovereignty over their lands, by trying to bring things together, different kinds of knowledge, and through education, and trying to reach as many non-Indigenous people as possible to help them understand that we'll all benefit from seeing things in a different way. So that's it for this week, our last week before the break. As usual, if you have any questions, you know how to reach me.